In an ideal world, humanitarian aid wouldn't be necessary. But in our world, it is the backbone of global stability. It's the quiet, often unseen force that steps in when systems fail. It feeds the hungry in drought-stricken lands, shelters families displaced by conflict, and offers a lifeline to refugees fleeing persecution. More than just providing basic necessities, this aid works to stabilize fragile regions, preventing entire societies from collapsing under the immense pressure of war, severe climate shocks, and devastating economic breakdowns. It represents a global promise that in times of crisis, no one will be left entirely alone. But today, that promise is being broken, and the backbone that supports millions is cracking under the strain. Across the world, a dangerous and steady collapse in humanitarian funding is underway. It isn't a single dramatic event, but a quiet, creeping crisis that is dismantling the infrastructure of compassion piece by piece. For years, aid organizations have been sounding the alarm, warning that donor fatigue, shifting political priorities, and the sheer scale of global need are creating a perfect storm. Now, those warnings are a reality. In refugee camps from Africa to the Middle East, essential services are being drastically scaled back. Food rations, once a reliable source of sustenance, are being cut in half, then cut again. Vital medical programs are shutting down, leaving chronic illnesses untreated and outbreaks unchecked. For millions of people who once relied on this international safety net, the erosion of support is pushing them toward one final desperate option: migration. When the place you are is no longer sustainable, and the help you counted on has vanished, the only choice left is to move. This isn't a choice for a better life, but a choice for life itself. This is the story of the global humanitarian funding collapse, a story about budgets and policies, but more importantly, about people. We will explore why it's happening, how it's unfolding on the ground, and how the failure of our global support system is directly triggering new, unprecedented waves of human movement across continents. The world's humanitarian system is breaking. For decades, humanitarian aid has been the invisible force preventing global chaos. It has kept refugee camps functioning, supported conflict zones, stabilized border regions, and provided lifelines to millions. But today, that system is under unprecedented strain. Humanitarian agencies report severe funding shortages, major cuts to food programs, reduced medical services, shrinking refugee support, delayed emergency responses, overwhelmed field operations. The world is facing more crises than ever, but with less money than ever to respond. This imbalance is creating a dangerous chain reaction. Why humanitarian funding is collapsing. The shortfall in humanitarian aid isn't a simple dip, it's a structural collapse, a perfect storm of global pressures converging at once. The gap between the needs of vulnerable populations and the funds available to help them has widened into a chasm, now measured in the tens of billions of dollars annually. This isn't just a statistical problem. It represents a profound crisis for millions of people whose survival depends on this support. Let's break down the key factors driving this collapse. First, the relentless rise of conflicts worldwide. From protracted civil wars to new outbreaks of violence, the number of active conflicts has surged. Each new crisis creates a new wave of displacement, forcing millions from their homes and creating an exponential increase in the need for food, shelter, and medical care. The sheer scale is overwhelming. Donor countries, even with the best intentions, are finding it impossible to keep pace with the escalating demands generated by this global instability. The system was not built for this level of concurrent, large-scale emergencies. Second, widespread economic slowdowns. The very nations that have historically been the largest contributors to humanitarian aid are now grappling with their own severe domestic challenges. Soaring inflation, rising energy costs, and the looming threat of recession have forced governments to tighten their belts. When national budgets are cut, foreign aid, and particularly humanitarian funding, is often one of the first and easiest targets for reduction. This inward focus means that discretionary spending on international crises is deprioritized in favor of addressing pressing issues at home. Third, a pervasive sense of donor fatigue. The constant stream of crises over the past decade has taken its toll, not just on governments, but on the general public as well. After years of appeals for earthquakes, famines, and wars, both institutional and private donors are exhausted. This fatigue is especially damaging for what are known as protracted crises, emergencies that last for years or even decades. Media attention fades, public interest wanes, and funding pipelines slowly dry up, leaving millions in a state of suspended limbo with no end in sight. Fourth, significant political shifts. In several key donor countries, there has been a distinctive turn toward more nationalist or inward-looking policies. This political reorientation often translates directly into reduced commitments to international cooperation and foreign aid. The narrative shifts from global responsibility to national interest, and funding that was once allocated to support international humanitarian law and principles is redirected to domestic priorities or security-focused foreign policy, further shrinking the pool of available resources for neutral, impartial aid. And finally, a landscape of competing global priorities. The humanitarian system is no longer just responding to conflict. It is now on the front lines of climate change, dealing with the fallout from unprecedented floods, droughts, and storms. It is a critical part of the response to global pandemics and their secondary impacts. It is grappling with the consequences of global economic instability. Each of these mega-crises demands immense resources, stretching the entire international system to its breaking point and forcing impossible choices about who gets help and who is left behind. The result of this convergence is a humanitarian system teetering on the brink of collapse, unable to fulfill its fundamental mandate: to save lives and alleviate suffering for the world's most vulnerable people. The human impact. When aid disappears, people move. When humanitarian aid collapses, people face impossible choices. Imagine a refugee camp where food rations are cut in half, a medical clinic that shuts down, a school that closes, a water system that fails, a shelter program that ends, a border region where support disappears. People do not stay and starve. They do not stay and suffer. They do not stay and wait for help that will never come. They move. Humanitarian collapse is not just a funding issue, it is a migration trigger. When international funding for humanitarian aid is reduced, it doesn't just mean less support. It triggers a powerful chain reaction that directly fuels new waves of migration. These programs are often the only thing providing stability in regions already fractured by conflict or disaster. When that support system is dismantled, piece by piece, it creates a domino effect, forcing people to make impossible choices. Let's break down how this happens. It often begins with the most basic necessity: food. When food rations are cut, a lifeline is severed. For families in refugee camps, this isn't a minor inconvenience. It's a direct threat to their survival. Faced with malnutrition and starvation, they are left with no alternative but to abandon the relative safety of the camp. They embark on perilous journeys toward urban centers or neighboring countries, searching for work and sustenance. Next, medical services collapse. When funding for clinics disappears, they are forced to close their doors. This leaves vulnerable populations without access to essential healthcare, from vaccinations for children to life-saving treatments for chronic illnesses. For a parent with a sick child or an elder needing consistent care, the only option is to move, seeking a country where healthcare is accessible. Then comes the loss of shelter. When housing programs are defunded, temporary shelters are dismantled and support for displaced families ends. This forces people out of organized settlements and into precarious living situations, often in overcrowded urban slums or unsafe border regions, exposing them to exploitation and violence. Education is another critical casualty. Schooling provides children with a sense of normalcy and a path to a better life. When these programs lose funding, schools close, and an entire generation loses its future. For parents, the decision becomes heartbreakingly clear. They must migrate to give their children a chance at an education and a life beyond the camp. This erosion of services leads to a breakdown in security. Humanitarian agencies provide more than just aid. Their presence offers a layer of protection. When they are forced to withdraw, a power vacuum emerges. Local militias or criminal gangs often move in, increasing violence and instability, and pushing even more people to flee for their lives. The cumulative effect is immense pressure on international borders. As each pillar of humanitarian support crumbles, the flow of people seeking refuge intensifies, leading to surges at border crossings. This demonstrates a fundamental truth. A humanitarian collapse is a primary driver of global migration. Regions most affected by the collapse. The funding collapse is global, but some regions are hit harder than others. Africa, Sudan, South Sudan, Ethiopia, Somalia, DRC, all facing massive displacement with shrinking aid. Middle East, Syria, Yemen, Gaza, humanitarian programs are overwhelmed and underfunded. Asia. Rohingya refugees face severe cuts in food, shelter, and education. Latin America. Venezuelan migrants face reduced support across the region. Europe's border regions. Aid groups supporting migrants in Greece, Italy, and the Balkans are struggling. The collapse of refugee camps. Refugee camps are often the first to feel funding cuts. When aid disappears, food rations shrink, water systems fail, schools close, medical clinics shut down, security weakens, shelters deteriorate. Families who once relied on camp support are forced to leave. Some move to cities, some move to border regions, some move across continents. Refugee camp collapse is one of the strongest migration triggers in the world. The collapse of urban humanitarian programs. Many displaced people live in cities, not camps. When urban programs lose funding, rent assistance ends, food vouchers disappear, medical subsidies stop, education support collapses, social services shrink, urban displacement becomes urban migration. People move from cities to borders, borders to neighboring countries, and neighboring countries to global routes. Humanitarian collapse creates migration chains. The collapse of border support systems. Border regions rely heavily on humanitarian aid. When funding collapses, border shelters close, screening centers lose staff, emergency services disappear, migrants face dangerous conditions, smuggling networks expand. This creates irregular migration, dangerous crossings, human trafficking risks, and overwhelmed border authorities. Humanitarian collapse destabilizes borders and increases migration flows. The collapse of climate response programs. Climate disasters are increasing worldwide, but climate response programs are shrinking. When climate aid collapses, farmers lose crops, families lose homes, communities lose water, regions lose stability. Climate migration increases. Humanitarian collapse plus climate shocks equals mass displacement. The future, a world on the move. The global humanitarian funding collapse is not temporary, it is structural. As long as conflicts rise, climate disasters intensify, economies struggle, donor fatigue grows, and political priorities shift, humanitarian aid will remain under pressure, and migration will continue to rise. We are entering a new era of global movement, shaped not just by conflict or climate, but by the collapse of the systems meant to protect the vulnerable. A crisis behind every crisis. The global humanitarian funding collapse is the crisis behind every crisis. It is the silent force pushing families to move. It is the invisible pressure driving border surges. It is the hidden trigger behind migration waves. It is the collapse that makes every other collapse worse. Understanding this collapse is essential to understanding the future of global migration. Subscribe for more adventures.